On July 4th, 1776, in Philadelphia, Americans voted to publish a Declaration of Independence. This declaration said that they were fed up with the rule of the King of England and that they were starting their own new nation. But King George wasn't going to let them go that easily. The American Revolutionary War would continue on for several years. This is the story of the American struggle and final victory in the American Revolution. My name is Dr. Rick Gardiner from Columbus State University, and this is a Muscogee County School District podcast, The American Revolution. Though the members of the Second Continental Congress declared the United States independent of England in July of 1776, the declaration meant nothing to the King of England and the British Army. They were not about to allow the Americans to leave the empire without a fight. The Americans needed to do more than declare independence. They had to defeat the British military that was there in America to prevent the Americans from starting a new country. In the summer of 1776, the war turned into an awful struggle for the Americans. After the British were surprised by losing several battles to the Americans in New England, the British decided to target the New York area as the place to focus their energy. This was almost in the middle of the colonies, and it would separate New England from any southern support. In addition to his English redcoats, the king hired a lot of German soldiers called Hessians to help his army beat the Americans in this war. George Washington brought his Continental Army down to New York, hopefully to repeat the success he had in Boston. But this time, it would not be so easy. On August 27, 1776, the largest battle of the American Revolution was fought on Brooklyn Heights near New York City. It was a disaster for George Washington and his troops. When the battle ended, Washington's army was surrounded on the edge of a river. But thankfully, nightfall came upon the battlefield, so the British army assumed that in the morning, either Washington would be forced to surrender or his whole army would be killed or captured. But during the night, Washington and his men accomplished a miracle. Without being noticed, they very quietly slipped across the river to Manhattan Island. During the escape, Washington commanded every man not to speak a word. They muffled their wagon wheels. Some men's jobs were to stay back until morning just to keep the fires burning very big so that the British might believe that the whole army was still camping there. When daylight came, there were still a lot of men who had not yet escaped across the river, and surely they would be caught, and this would be the end. But just about that time, an incredibly dense fog settled on the area, and no one could see anything. Washington's whole army escaped, and according to George Washington, it was heaven's help that made it possible. The Battle of Brooklyn Heights, also called the Battle of Long Island, hurt the American army badly. They lost about 1,000 soldiers who were captured during the battle, and another 300 were killed, many of whom were stabbed in the back by Hessians, even after they put their hands up and surrendered. One of the most famous Americans who was captured was Nathan Hale. The Redcoats hung him as a spy. According to tradition, just before they hung him, Hale said, "My only regret is that I have but one life to give for my country." The fact of the matter was this: the British Army and Navy were the greatest, best trained, and strongest on the face of the planet Earth. The American Army was little more than a group of farmers and craftsmen who were volunteers, young and old. Perhaps they had gotten lucky at Lexington and Concord, at Ticonderoga and Bunker Hill. But now the game was on. And the Americans looked like a little league football team trying to play against the New Orleans Saints. There was just no way that the Americans could win. Washington was not a quitter, though. He was a genius. Because the Americans couldn't match up to the British in battle, Washington would have to use sneaky tricks. Most of the men in the Continental Army were volunteers who signed up at the beginning of 1776, and they signed an agreement to stay in the Army for 1 year. On January 1st, 1777, they would be free to go home. And because things didn't look so good, most were planning to go home at the end of 1776, and General Washington knew it. If they left, this would mean the end of the war, surrender to the British, and tearing up the Declaration of Independence. No more United States of America. Washington knew he had to do something before the end of the year that would give the men a sense of excitement, enthusiasm, passion. Washington believed that if he could just keep the spirit of his troops high, God would intervene in a special way and give the United States victory. Washington's strategy was this. He would take his army to attack the city of Trenton, New Jersey. This city was in the full control of the German soldiers that the King of England hired. They were well-trained, fearless, and ruthless killers. Most of Washington's men were scared of these Hessian soldiers. Here was Washington's thinking. The enemies were Germans, and Germans have a reputation of drinking a lot of beer, especially on holidays. Washington would wait until Christmas Day, after the Hessians were good and drunk, and then he would sneak up on them and catch them passed out in their beds in the early morning. Sneaking up on the Hessians would be no easy task. Trenton was on the east side of the river, on the New Jersey side, and Washington's army were encamped on the west side of the river in Pennsylvania. The Delaware River separated the armies. If the Hessians were alerted, they could wipe out Washington's whole army right in the middle of the Delaware River. Washington's men would have to move very quietly and very quickly across the river in the middle of the night. They had some experience doing this already in New York, but that time they were escaping, and this time they were attacking. The plan worked. Washington crossed the Delaware on Christmas night, 1776, and snuck up on the Hessians in Trenton in the morning, capturing almost 1,000 Germans and killing 30. Washington accomplished his most important goal. His men were so delighted by this victory that most of them decided to sign an agreement to fight for at least another year. A few days later, Washington marched the troops down to nearby Princeton, New Jersey, and there defeated General Cornwallis's troops occupying that town. The year 1777 started with a great sense of excitement for the Americans, but the struggle was still great. In 1777, the Continental Congress started to think seriously about the identity of their new nation. They needed a constitution. They began to write one at that time, and they called it the Articles of Confederation. They needed symbols to identify their nation. They needed a seal. They needed mottos, and they needed a flag. According to the legend, a Philadelphia seamstress named Elizabeth Ross was the person who came up with the United States flag in 1777. On June 14, 1777, the flag was brought to the Second Continental Congress. They liked it, and they voted for it to be the flag of the United States. Every June 14th, we celebrate that event. We call it Flag Day. Perhaps more important than anything else, the United States needed allies, other countries that might help them in this struggle. The country that was particularly of interest was France. The French and the English had been enemies for a long time, and perhaps the French would enjoy the opportunity to help out the Americans. Perhaps the person who was best able to convince the French was an American named Benjamin Franklin. In Paris, France, Franklin was more popular than he was in Philadelphia. Franklin and some other Americans were able to persuade the King of France to support the Americans, but it was on one condition. The Americans needed to prove themselves by winning a big battle. That would come in September and October of 1777, when, to the great surprise of almost everyone, a portion of the American army, led by Horatio Gates at Saratoga, New York, defeated a British army led by John Burgoyne. The surrender of Burgoyne to Gates is perhaps the most important turning point of the entire war, because from then on, the French would join the war on the side of the Americans, making the competition much fairer. The winter time was again horrible for Washington and his troops. Philadelphia experienced one of the coldest and snowiest winters in history. Washington's men were camping through the winter near Philadelphia at Valley Forge. His men were cold, hungry, and sick. Again, Washington's biggest concern was keeping his soldiers from quitting, and many wanted to. Here, Washington's leadership was at its best. He sacrificed with his soldiers. He demonstrated tremendous love and compassion for the men. And according to tradition, he got on his knees and prayed at Valley Forge with all his heart. There were two great foreign leaders with Washington at Valley Forge, General Steuben from Germany and General Lafayette from France. And France was now entirely on the side of the United States. At Valley Forge, again, Washington accomplished his goal. His men hung in there because they wanted to honor their dedicated leader, George Washington. Meanwhile, in England, many of the British leaders were ready to give up the fight with the United States. It wasn't worth it. General Washington knew that the British were wearing out, and if he could just keep his men going, the United States were bound to win. 1778 and 1779 included some very tough battles with the British, such as the bloody Battle of Monmouth, where a woman named Molly Pitcher took over for her husband when he went down in the fight. But there were also some tremendous successes. John Paul Jones led the first U.S. naval victory in the Bonhomme Richard, defeating the HMS Serapis. In the southern states, a portion of the American army, led by a general named Francis Marion, enjoyed several victories against the British general Cornwallis and his soldiers. In 1780, the Americans again came very close to losing everything. An American general named Benedict Arnold, who had been a great hero during the Battle of Saratoga, made a secret agreement with a British spy named Major Andre that he would surrender the fort at West Point in New York over to the British Army if the king would just pay General Arnold a great deal of money and give him a high position in the British Army. If this sneaky deal succeeded, the Americans could be finished. On his way back to British headquarters, Major Andre was stopped by a few patrols. When they made him take off his shoes, they found the papers with the secret deal that Benedict Arnold signed. They went and warned General Washington immediately, and Washington quickly went to West Point to stop this from happening. But before that, Benedict Arnold found out that his plan was discovered, and he ran away to hide with the British. Arnold escaped to England, where he lived for the rest of his life in shame. Major Andre was not so lucky. George Washington made sure that Andre received the punishment given to all spies. The following year, 1781, would be the last for the war. General Cornwallis, being beaten in several battles in South and North Carolina, turned his Redcoat army toward Yorktown, Virginia, where he was hoping they would be rescued by the British Navy. Cornwallis's army was surrounded by the Americans and the French at Yorktown. All the great leaders were there: Washington, Lafayette, Rochambeau, Knox, Steuben. When the British looked out to the sea, hoping to see their navy there to rescue them, instead they saw the French navy. They were surrounded on every side. On October 19, 1781, the last great army of the British surrendered at Yorktown. The war was over. George Washington had accomplished the impossible. A small volunteer army, the great underdogs, had defeated the world's greatest army. The United States of America was going to survive, and soon they would need someone to be their first president. No one in the whole nation had any doubt as to who the best person would be for that job.